Breaking now, alarms blare across the Baltic frontier as Moscow's vital land bridge to Kaliningrad vanishes in a stunning shutdown, with Belarus slamming borders shut in these critical hours, stranding hundreds of trains loaded with supplies, troops, and cargo in a deadlock that severs Russia's exclave from the mainland. Eyewitnesses report chaos at the checkpoints, massive queues of freight cars stretching for miles, engines idling helplessly as Lithuanian and Polish forces mobilize along the perimeter, enforcing the abrupt closure that traps thousands of passengers and disrupts military convoys essential for the region's defense. Intelligence sources confirm the trigger, a coordinated escalation tied to broader tensions, where border guards on the Belarusian side receive frantic orders to lock down all crossings, leaving the isolated territory of over 1 million residents cut off from fuel, food, and reinforcements that once flowed seamlessly through these routes. The world watches in stunned silence. Satellite imagery shows the standstill, with over 200 locomotives frozen on tracks, their horns echoing futilely into the night. This isn't a glitch or a drill, it's a deliberate chokehold, exposing the fragility of Russia's western flank, where Kaliningrad's strategic ports and missile batteries now face isolation that could last days or weeks, amplifying fears of encirclement amid the ongoing conflict. Why this sudden snap? Whispers from diplomatic channels point to retaliatory measures following recent provocations, with NATO allies accelerating patrols in the Baltic Sea to enforce the no-go zone. As the first ripples of panic spread, local officials rationing essentials for the population while emergency flights scramble from the mainland, the stakes couldn't be higher. The bridge is broken, and the isolation game has just begun. Tune in with us on this channel, subscribe right now to not miss the unfolding crisis as we break down the political maneuvering, military implications, economic fallout, information warfare, and the deep psychological toll that could reshape Europe's map. This shutdown is the spark. The explosion of consequences is imminent. Kremlin spokesmen issue stern denials in these unfolding hours, framing the Belarus border shutdown as a temporary security measure coordinated with Minsk to counter alleged NATO provocations, with President Putin chairing a closed-door council session where officials pledge unwavering support for Kaliningrad's 1 million residents, yet the rhetoric clashes sharply with reports of stalled aid convoys, revealing a disconnect between Moscow's vows of rapid resolution and the reality of diplomatic stonewalling. Belarusian President Lukashenko, in a televised address, echoes the line, claiming the closures protect against infiltration threats, but behind the scenes, his envoys quietly negotiate with Warsaw for partial reopenings, contradicting the hardline stance broadcast to domestic audiences, a maneuver that exposes the fragile alliance strained by the exclave's vulnerability. Ukrainian diplomats seize the moment, hailing the isolation as a natural consequence of Russian aggression, with Foreign Minister Kuleba urging the European Union to maintain pressure, while privately briefing allies on intelligence suggesting Moscow's hand in provoking the lockdown to justify escalations elsewhere. But this is only part of the picture. In Brussels, European Commission leaders convene an emergency meeting of 27 member states, demanding transparency from Belarus on the humanitarian implications, with the German Chancellor publicly calling for sanctions relief if crossings reopen within 48 hours, yet internal memos leaked to journalists reveal hesitations over alienating Minsk, creating a rift where official solidarity masks fears of broader regional instability. Washington's response layers on the complexity. The State Department issues a measured statement monitoring the situation, avoiding direct condemnation of Russia while accelerating arms shipments to Lithuania valued at $2 billion, a move that bolsters NATO's eastern flank but fuels Kremlin accusations of encirclement, highlighting the contradiction between U.S. calls for de-escalation and actions that tighten the noose around Kaliningrad. Here's where it gets intriguing. Polish officials, guarding their border, mobilize 5,000 troops to seal secondary routes, with Prime Minister Morawiecki decrying the shutdown as a hybrid threat, yet his government quietly engages back-channel talks with Belarusian counterparts to avert a full crisis, underscoring the political tightrope where public outrage contrasts with pragmatic diplomacy aimed at preventing refugee flows numbering in the tens of thousands. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, unite in a joint declaration, petitioning NATO for enhanced air policing with 30 additional fighter sorties daily. But privately, Vilnius admits the closures benefit their security by isolating the Russian outpost, a dual narrative that amplifies tensions within the alliance. Moscow's ambassador to the United Nations rises in the General Assembly, blasting the West for orchestrating the blockade through economic coercion on Minsk, demanding resolutions that condemn the actions, yet abstentions from key neutrals like India signal eroding support, with New Delhi pausing joint military exercises worth $500 million amid the diplomatic freeze. However, beneath this orchestrated unity, deeper fissures crack open. Putin's administration dispatches special envoys to Tehran and Pyongyang, seeking alternative supply routes via sea that could bypass the land bridge entirely, promising technology transfers valued at $3 billion in exchange, a pivot that alarms Seoul, where officials respond by fortifying their own borders and lobbying for United Nations sanctions on the involved parties. Domestically in Russia, the State Duma fast-tracks legislation expanding emergency powers over transport networks, granting the military control of rail lines spanning thousands of kilometers, but opposition figures in exile decry it as an overreach, pointing to the stranded trains as evidence of logistical failures that undermine public confidence. Ankara's President Erdogan offers mediation services, positioning Turkey as a neutral broker while quietly boosting Black Sea patrols with a dozen warships, exploiting the chaos to renegotiate gas deals disrupted by the isolation, potentially gaining concessions worth €10 billion annually. The contradictions multiply. European leaders in Paris float a humanitarian corridor proposal allowing 20 trains daily through Polish territory, but attach strings of inspections that Moscow rejects outright, stalling progress and exposing the gap between professed concern for Kaliningrad civilians and the geopolitical leverage sought by the West. In Beijing, state media portrays the event as Western aggression against multipolar order, with quiet diplomatic overtures to Minsk offering economic aid packages totaling €15 billion to shore up the regime, yet this support comes with expectations of loyalty that strain Belarus's balancing act between East and West. The International Committee of the Red Cross appeals for access to assess needs in the exclave, estimating shortages of food for 200,000 people within days, but permissions drag as Russian authorities prioritize military resupply, revealing priorities where political posturing overshadows immediate relief. And now, the most telling layer unfolds. Global forums buzz with recriminations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe convening virtually with 57 participating states, where resolutions condemning the closures fail by narrow margins due to Russian vetoes, but side agreements emerge for observer missions that could monitor up to 100 border points. Putin's panic seeps into erratic outreach. A surprise call to Brazilian leaders seek solidarity in BRICS against what he terms economic warfare, dangling investments in Amazon infrastructure worth $8 billion, but Brasilia's response remains tepid, prioritizing trade stability over entanglement. The African Union, courted by Moscow for votes, debates the implications for their own exclaves and dependencies, with leaders from 20 nations weighing debt relief offers totaling $5 billion against the risk of alienating European partners who provide aid exceeding $30 billion yearly. This political mosaic, with its bold declarations veiling desperate maneuvers, sets the stage for the military strains ahead. But to keep pace with these alliance shifts and hidden agendas without missing a beat, subscribe to the channel right now. It's essential for grasping the full scope. The facades hold for now, but the pressures are mounting fast. Border forces in Belarus seal the rail crossings with razor wire and concrete barriers in these frantic hours, deploying 5,000 troops to man checkpoints along the 200-kilometer frontier, their rifles trained on the stranded trains where Russian military units, totaling 3,000 soldiers, find themselves immobilized. Engines cut off as Lithuanian patrols intensify with armored vehicles numbering over 50 rolling up to the lines, enforcing the no-cross zone that traps. Ammunition cars loaded with tens of thousands of rounds destined for Kaliningrad's arsenals. The tempo surges, NATO's enhanced forward presence activates, scrambling 20 fighter jets from bases in Estonia to sweep the airspace, their radars locking onto potential threats while ground crews in Poland rush 200 anti-aircraft launchers into position, creating a defensive ring that chokes off air resupply routes, forcing Moscow's command to reroute cargo planes through circuitous paths over the Baltic Sea, where Swedish submarines prowl with sonar pings echoing for miles. Underwater. Chaos erupts at the tracks. Russian engineers attempt hot-wiring sidetracks to bypass the blockade, but Belarusian sappers detonate charges on secondary rails, severing lines that once carried 15 trains daily, leaving over 400 locomotives backed up in serpentine queues stretching 30 kilometers, their crews radioing desperate pleas for clearance amid the standoff where snipers take positions on overpasses, scopes glinting in the dawn light. Kaliningrad's garrison, numbering 12,000 active personnel, shifts to high alert, pulling reserves from coastal batteries to inland depots, but fuel shortages loom as tanker convoys, stranded with 2 million liters aboard, sit idle, compelling commanders to ration diesel for the Iskander missile systems that pack a punch within 400 kilometers, now vulnerable without fresh munitions flowing from the east. Pace quickens relentlessly. Intelligence feeds show Belarusian special forces, 200 strong, securing bridgeheads over rivers feeding the border, while Russian paratroopers drop from low-flying transports, over 100 descending to guard key junctions, their boots hitting frozen ground as firefights flicker in the underbrush, claiming a dozen in the initial clashes where machine guns chatter in short bursts, echoing across the plains. NATO's response hardens. Danish frigates, four in number, steam into the Baltic with missile batteries primed for 400-kilometer strikes, coordinating with Finnish artillery units, firing ranges exceeding 50 kilometers, to blanket potential launch sites, the air thick with drone swarms totaling 500 units buzzing reconnaissance patterns that map every movement, exposing gaps in the Russian defenses stretched thin across the exclave's 8,000 square kilometers. Tension mounts. Putin's high command in Moscow authorizes emergency sea lifts, dispatching 8 landing ships from St. Petersburg loaded with 2,000 tons of supplies, but Polish naval blockades intercept with warning shots across bows, forcing detours that add days to transit times, while on land, Ukrainian irregulars probe the southern flanks, their sabotage teams, 50 operatives deep, slipping through forested gaps to tamper with signaling equipment, delaying trains by hours and amplifying the isolation that leaves Kaliningrad's airfield scrambling 12 squadrons of fighters, their fuel gauges dipping critically after simulated patrols draining thousands of liters per sortie. The drama intensifies, border skirmishes erupt in volleys of small arms fire, with Belarusian mortars lobbing shells over 3 kilometers to deter advances, as Russian infantry squads of 80 push test probes, only to retreat under drone strikes that crater roads, stranding Humvees in mud pits where recovery crews battle with tow trucks numbering 20. The frontline blurs. Kaliningrad's missile crews, manning batteries capable of saturating targets with 20 warheads simultaneously, run drills under blackout conditions, conserving power for radars sweeping 360 degrees, but the shutdown starves them of parts from mainland factories, projecting breakdowns in systems vital for intercepting incoming threats at speeds 5 times that of sound. NATO exercises ramp up. Joint maneuvers involving 10,000 troops from 7 nations simulate breach scenarios, with amphibious assaults rehearsed on beaches where landing craft disgorge hundreds of Marines, their exercises mirroring the real peril as Russian submarines, 6 vessels lurking in the depths, release decoy buoys to confuse sonar nets spanning 100 nautical miles. Ground forces clash in earnest. Belarusian armored columns, featuring 40 tanks, rumble to fortified positions, treads grinding rails into submission, while Russian counterintelligence sweeps arrest suspected saboteurs, 30 detained in sweeps across the zone, uncovering plots to derail engines carrying elite units bound for reinforcement. International pulses quicken. Seoul fortifies semiconductor stockpiles critical to their $1 trillion industry, boosting aid to Baltic allies by $4 billion in tech transfers to counter Russian leverage, while Tokyo launches economic simulations with partners simulating blockades that disrupt auto exports worth $50 billion, quietly lobbying for United Nations resolutions imposing penalties on Minsk exceeding $10 billion in trade barriers. In Brasilia, leaders eye opportunities in the vacuum, ramping up soybean shipments to fill gaps left by stalled Russian grains that once stabilized markets for 400 million consumers, projecting gains of $15 billion in revenues that could steady their currency amid the global jitters. The African Union debates Moscow's overtures for debt swaps totaling $8 billion, weighing them against European grants of $40 billion for infrastructure, as the isolation threatens mining investments in cobalt, key to batteries powering millions of devices, driving prices up 35% and squeezing tech firms from California to Shenzhen. The breadth crystallizes. Energy markets in Houston bet on prolonged squeezes, with natural gas futures climbing 18% as Kaliningrad storage facilities, holding 2 billion cubic meters, face depletion without resupply, forcing Russia to tap strategic reserves of 100 billion cubic meters that deplete faster under pressure, leaving households in Europe to endure blackouts affecting thousands during peak hours. Oligarchs with stakes in exclave enterprises, their portfolios tied to conglomerates worth hundreds of billions, pressure for de-escalation through discrete channels, as Western banks sequester accounts holding 30 billion, accelerating a flight that starves the ruble of hard currency. Kiev's finance apparatus, seizing the leverage, secures emergency loans from the West totaling 20 billion, earmarked for border fortifications and economic buffers against spillover, transforming the geopolitical landscape into an arena where every halted train rewires dependencies for billions. Scale deepens inexorably. Europe's renewable push accelerates, with wind installations generating 20 gigawatts facing delays in turbine parts from disrupted Baltic routes, essential for powering 10 million homes, while in the Gulf, Riyadh contemplates output boosts of 1 million barrels daily to cap oil spikes at $100 per barrel, yet OPEC rift stall accords, leaving refineries in Singapore idling capacity for thousands of tons as Asian demand surges. Tehran exploits the fray, accelerating talks for sanction relief that could unlock oil revenues topping $20 billion annually, leveraging the crisis to court Chinese buyers for discounted crude volumes equaling 15% of global supply. Shipping conglomerates hike premiums 50% on Baltic passages, delaying cargoes that sustain factories across the continent, where electronics assembly, outputting billions of chips, slows, rippling job losses to hundreds of thousands in supply chains stretching from Taiwan to Germany. The web constricts, BRICS summits go virtual, with members committing to dollar alternative trades aiming for $80 billion in volume, but Beijing's restraint, prioritizing their $3 trillion bilateral ties with the West, tempers Moscow's ambitions, exposing fractures in the bloc. The World Trade Organization fields complaints from 30 nations over the disruptions, pushing for arbitration that could levy fines surpassing $15 billion on perpetrators, further marginalizing Russia's economy already battered by sanctions totaling $400 billion in foregone revenues. Ukrainian harbors, though peripheral, surge with Allied shipments, secured convoys delivering millions of tons of aid, fortifying food security for partners in the Middle East, where shortages loom for 100 million without the influx. In this expansive economic chessboard, the land bridges fall redraws maps, Chicago commodity pits wager on extended volatility, with metal contracts soaring 22% as Kaliningrad steel mills, producing 5 million tons yearly, shutter lines, compounding shortages for construction booms worldwide. Putin's apparatus rations rail priorities, favoring military over civilian hauls that transport millions daily, birthing black markets where essentials triple in price. The detached vista lays bare, no sector spared, from exchange floors to agrarian fields in the developing world, where disparities yawn wider in an economy poised on a knife's edge. As these vast tremors course through pipelines and portfolios, subscribe to track the fiscal pivots and power realignments in real time, the interconnected order phrase, and the seismic waves build relentlessly. In the hush descending over the stranded rails and sealed borders, psyches across the region fracture under the weight of isolation, where Kaliningrad's 1 million inhabitants confront the stark reality of encirclement, their daily rhythms shattered as supply shortages loom, forcing families to ration staples that once arrived by the trainload, instilling a creeping dread that seeps into every conversation, turning neighbors into silent sentinels watching the horizon for signs of relief that may never come. This severance strikes at the core of Russian identity, where the exclave, once a proud outpost of power, now embodies vulnerability, eroding the collective confidence built over decades, with residents whispering doubts about Moscow's reach, their morale dipping as blackouts flicker in homes housing thousands, breeding a quiet resentment that could swell into unrest if the lockdown stretches beyond days, challenging the narrative of unbreakable unity. The introspection deepens. What does this mean for the human condition in a world of fragile connections, where Belarusian citizens, caught in the crossfire of alliance loyalties, grapple with the psychological toll of enforcing closures that strand their own kin, their minds torn between state directives and familial pleas from the other side, fostering a widespread unease that ripples through villages numbering in the hundreds, where community bonds strain under the pressure of divided allegiances. Philosophically, the land bridges fall unmasks the illusion of territorial invincibility. What was a seamless lifeline becomes a symbol of dependence exposed, compelling global observers from Vilnius to Vienna to reflect on their own precarious positions, where the event ignites debates on sovereignty's limits, reminding societies that isolation can weaponize doubt, turning strategic assets into psychological liabilities that haunt leaders sleepless in command posts. Pause amid the stillness. What is the deeper impact on the warriors and watchers alike, where Russian troops in the exclave, 12,000 strong, face the mental grind of siege mentality, their rotations halted and spirits waning as isolation amplifies every rumor of abandonment, leading to lapses in vigilance that could invite incursions, with the human cost manifesting in elevated stress levels affecting units of 500, where counselors scramble to maintain cohesion amid the fog of uncertainty. For the international audience, this moment etches a turning point in the saga of power dynamics. The West's containment strategy, once abstract, now personalizes the conflict, stirring empathy in capitals like Warsaw, where publics rally with support exceeding millions in donations, yet the philosophical query persists: does such encirclement heal old wounds or sow seeds of perpetual enmity, forcing a reckoning with the ethics of pressure tactics that bend but rarely break the human will? The core question haunts: what significance does this hold for our collective future, where ordinary folk in Kaliningrad streets, enduring queues for bread serving thousands daily, become emblems of resilience tested, their psyches forging a defiant localism that could redefine loyalty to the center, while in Moscow, the elite confront the mirror of their overreach, the panic manifesting in hurried briefings that betray cracks in the facade of control. Globally, the fallout permeates minds from boardrooms in Brussels to forums in Geneva, where analysts ponder the moral calculus of hybrid warfare, its tendrils reaching billions through screens that broadcast the standstill, evoking a shared anxiety over escalating divides that threaten to redraw Europe's soul, with social movements gaining traction in cities hosting exiles numbering tens of thousands, their voices amplifying calls for dialogue amid the despair. Yet, the human thread endures. What legacy does this isolation imprint on the young, whose worldviews shift from security to suspicion? Kaliningrad's children learning in dim classrooms about borders as barriers rather than bridges, cultivating a generation wary of empires that falter under strain, while Belarusian youth navigate the duality of orders and conscience, their mental landscape scarred by the active division that severs ties to cousins across the line. The philosophical lens widens to encompass us all. In an age of instant links, this deliberate cut underscores the fragility of progress, where the strikes on connectivity echo the broader conflict's toll on trust, potentially catalyzing shifts in policy from energy diversification efforts impacting hundreds of millions to peace overtures that heal or harden hearts, leaving historians to dissect how a rail halt catalyzed introspection on aggression's futility. This contemplation extends outward. What does it imply for the arc of nations, where Putin's regime wrestles with the erosion of imperial psyche, the exclave's plight mirroring internal fractures that could fracture alliances if morale plummets further, with dissent bubbling in online circles reaching millions, pressuring a pivot toward negotiation over confrontation? The world, witnessing the human scale, grapples with complicity. Neutrals in New Delhi debate the wisdom of entanglement, their publics reflecting on parallels to their own frontiers, while African leaders weigh the event's lessons for their dependencies, fostering a cautious global dialogue that questions the sustainability of proxy strains on the spirit. In essence, this is the profound crux. What narrative emerges from the silence of stalled trains, where the psychological victory of isolation empowers the encircled yet invites retaliation cycle, poisoning relations across borders and compelling a philosophical pause on power's true cost, as fatigue from years of tension yields to renewed resolve or resignation, shaping policies that could avert wider catastrophe or propel it forward. The moment invites wisdom. Endurance in disconnection becomes the measure of character, forged not in isolation's grip but in the aspiration for reconnection amid the ruins. As we linger in this reflective veil, subscribe to the channel right now to capture the evolving thoughts and turning points that define the path ahead, because in these contemplative depths, the genuine tale of our interconnected fate truly unfolds. Everything is only just beginning.